Okay, so the first question I have for you is, what is the future of the electric car in India?
I think actually the future of electric is a given now. In fact, at one point in time, there were talks about when and if, and now I think all of those have been answered. I mean, the time is now for multiple reasons. One, that the environment is definitely a better environment is better off when we move to electric vehicles because it's got zero emissions. Second, the cost of ownership and the running cost of an electric vehicle is probably 1/6 or 1/7 of a traditional diesel or petrol or gasoline engine car, right? So on these factors itself, it's a winning proposition. Lastly, what we are also seeing is not just the, like I talked about environment and cost of ownership, but even the driving pleasure of an electric vehicle is far superior than the traditional engines, because these cars really, go, like for example, the MG that we have, the ZS EV, it goes from 0 to 108.1 seconds. So these are cars which really move fast. And lastly, they have less moving pieces. So it's a very, very silent drive and less repairs overall. So overall, I think it's a winning proposition.
Yeah. Okay. So what progress have we made to bring it to India at a large scale and at an affordable price?
So, I think let me explain to you how a particular car is brought in or a category is brought into a country. There are various stakeholders who get involved in this, right? So the government has a role to play in it. The local suppliers, they also have to, they have a very important role to play in this. And then, of course, the companies like ours, we play a role in bringing in the products also, or developing it within our own country as an indigenous development. So similarly, you have other parts of the ecosystem, like the charging infrastructure people, they have to be in place. The recycling of the batteries has to be in place. So all these stakeholders come together, and that is how the policy then gets moved forward. Now, I must say that, the government of India has been very progressive in this front, because we have a couple of policies like the FAME 1 and the FAME 2, which are encouraging. It's encouraging faster adoption of electric vehicles in India. What the government does typically is it offers subsidies. What it says is that, hey, you can bring in the technology into India, or you develop it in our country. But because there's a lot of investment required in the beginning, and if you were to pass on all that cost to the customer, very few guys will buy it. So what we'll do as a government is we will subsidize the cost. So you have some initial losses, but we'll also pitch in because we want more people to adopt it. The customer gets the benefit and it takes off. As the volume starts to build up, the local production becomes larger. That brings the cost down. You have more suppliers. So then, there's always the economics situation. More suppliers means better prices, better value for everybody. Then the prices overall comes down. So that is what, when we talk of subsidies, that is a very important part of triggering the entire chain to really get into the adoption of a new technology. That is one part of it. The second, obviously, is to make sure that you have the right products which really serve the customer. Typically in an electric vehicle, anything upwards of 250 kilometers on a range, or 200 plus also works well for an intra-city drive. Let's say, for example, the ZS that we have, it goes for 419 kilometers, but in most you get 300 kilometers, which means that for someone living in Gurgaon, you could go to Noida and back 3 days in a week, or even 4 days, and you won't be out of juice literally, because you could always, after the fourth day, you can come and charge your car, right? So you have to have a good product. It should be able to get some support, which is helpful if it's there. If it's not there, it just takes a bit longer, right? But then important is you trigger everybody in the system as well, which means you talk to charging companies to say, listen, we are bringing in the electric vehicle, we need some chargers. So they should be able to provide you the chargers as well. Then you come and talk to people to say, this battery will need recycling at the end of 5 or 10 years. Can we have some tie-up so that as responsible players, we bring in the green technology, but it should not be that it starts to add up more to pollution. So you have that part also figured out. Then you bring in all these cases together. A key part here is suppliers as well, component manufacturers. So then you look at people who can build these small components in India. As they start building up, you again are able to get a better cost structure. So that is how the whole ecosystem starts to build up. Like, you say that if you go back, 20 years, 25 years ago, we were importing televisions. We were importing air conditioners in our houses. And now all of them are built locally in India. So that is how, if a technology is not homegrown, you end up importing, but you develop local suppliers in the meantime. So long answer to your short question, in the case of electric vehicles now, the cell manufacturers are very few in the world, but everything else can actually be made in India.
Yeah.
So that will go through a journey.
Yeah, that was a really well explained answer, I think. So my third question for you is, how much CO2 or carbon dioxide emission can we save from making the switch to electric vehicles?
It varies from a car to car. One thing for sure is there that electric vehicles don't have the CO2 emissions. That I think is a positive side. Second, every vehicle would be different in terms of how many kilometers run and therefore how many grams of CO2 you're saving. That's a function of your car weight. So basically you offset it. You would say, if a similar car of a petrol or diesel would be driving, which could be the weight factor, etc., how much of emissions would it take? But now that since that same car is actually into an electric vehicle, it will not be having any emissions. So it could range from a car to car perspective.
Yeah, okay. And finally, how can we ensure the correct disposal of the electric car batteries to make sure that they are recycled?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very good question because, you could bring in electric vehicles, like I said, but, as a responsible player, you really have to look at closing the entire loop as well. So at the end of life, how do you look at recycling the batteries? Now, keep in mind that what the batteries which go into your phones, for example, lithium ion, and I mean, typically you could say a variant of that in a much larger scale and more dense is what you would use in a car as well. Loosely said. Now, how do you recycle those batteries? They go through a proper process. And at this point in time, there are very few partners in India who really are able to recycle car batteries. So we have, for example, tied up, there are a few of them. There's a company called Etero that's based near the Roorkee area. They are based there. There's a company called Tessam, and they're just starting to really recycle batteries. Obviously, the batteries don't have to get recycled tomorrow itself because these batteries last long. So typically, even after, and these batteries would lose, or let's say 1% or 2% on an annual basis. So if you do the 1% of a 300 kilometer kind of a range, you would still get something like 297, 294, 293. So even after 10 years, the battery can still give you something like 240 to 50 kilometers. So it's not that it's not functional at all, but obviously, many customers would like to upgrade their batteries or change their batteries. So at that time, the recycling becomes very handy. So there are two things, Aashvi, which come into picture. One is you talked about recycling. That is definitely required. But at the same time, these batteries can be used on other parts. So there are two elements of battery at the end of life. One, it goes for recycling, what we call as urban mining, which means you open up the battery, you take out all the precious elements like lithium, you take it out for recycling, cobalt, etc. That's good for recycling. The second is that you can use these batteries for other storage areas, like you have power stations, you have mobile towers. They need constant supply of power, so they come into that. Data storage centers need supply as well. So these batteries can be used there also, and they can be stacked up. So you have two usage of batteries: additional life, which could give sector like I talked about, like mobile towers or data centers, etc., or you go into recycling. recycling is still new for car batteries in India, but there are companies doing it for mobile phones, etc. And that's why more experience is required here.
Yeah, thank you for those in-depth answers.